What crossed your mind?
I was actually very disappointed that they would cozy up to the political leadership by funding and by sitting on the front row while the policies are so controversial. And while there's a lot of illegitimate power now in the hands of tech CEOs like Elon Musk, and it feels very opportunistic of all these CEOs to just join that crowd and have no regard for separation of powers, rule of law, lack of conflict of interest that we're now clearly seeing in what is unfolding since the inauguration.
When you came up with the title for the book, people probably asked you whether the word coup was over the top. Do you feel that it's justified now?
Well, I actually felt it was justified already because the power grab by tech companies at the expense of democracy often happens in less visible ways than what we're seeing now. And in many ways, the synergy, the overlap between the interests of the tech CEOs and the Trump administration is just the next phase of this tech coup. It makes it more blatant, more cynical, more radical. But it's an extension of the power grab that tech companies have been in visible and invisible ways for a while now, and where we just see a lack of countervailing powers, a lack of independent oversight. And I fear that the US is going exactly in the opposite direction of what we need, against strengthening democratic governance and providing balance against this outsized power of corporates in the tech sector.
So give me an example of how this is a threat to democracy, right? Because we're both old enough to recognize when, for example, the Arab Spring, not too long ago, and other different movements around the world, and we looked at these things in our hands as these amazing tools to try to increase access to democracy all over the globe. Have the ability to share our opinions. Literally people took to the streets in it. So how did that turn? You outlined this in the book.
Well, you're absolutely right that the promise of the internet, World Wide Web, mobile technologies, social media, was also one of democratization. That it would lift up unheard voices, allow people to document and share human rights abuses. But what has happened is that corporate interests, profit interests, scaling interests, investor goals for shareholders have just prevailed, and that democratic governments in the meantime have neglected their responsibility to make sure that governance decisions were designed to make sure that democracy would be achieved through the use of technology. Too much trust was put in market forces, and now we see that tech companies know so much about us, develop products and services that really challenge the role of states. Think about critical infrastructure or offensive cyber capabilities, intelligence capabilities that tech companies now have. And so there's just been a disbalance that has emerged where the companies are extremely powerful and they're not acting within a democratic mandate, within a democratic oversight. In many ways, they're overtaking the role of governments.
This seems, at least in America, to have happened under the watch of multiple administrations, Democrat and Republican, right? I mean, what did we not see coming? Initially, in terms of regulation, we had a very light touch. We wanted to encourage innovation. We wanted to have 1,000 flowers bloom, etc. And at what point could we have perhaps crafted a different path?
I think for a long time, there's been over-romanticization of what Silicon Valley was, what it could mean. The narrative was very much about disrupting powerful incumbents, about, small companies challenging the big actors, guys with their laptops in garages on flip-flops. But these companies scaled very quickly. They very quickly became the incumbents. And they're not only selling a product, but they're also integrating ever more data, ever more functions, ever more insights and dependencies in our lives, the lives of our governments, of our citizens, in our national security. They play a critical role. And so I think the romanticized narrative has just been believed for too long, and there's not been a recognition of what a power grab by these companies could mean. And indeed, it's been Democratic and Republican-led governments that have just allowed these companies to grow disproportionately and without the sufficient guardrails that are needed to protect people.
So it's interesting when you're right, that startup in the garage is what we think about of Silicon Valley, but when you sort of saw the mass to the president there, you saw the scale of how huge these companies are. I mean, it seems like there's maybe a half dozen or more super players that are integrated into what they like to call the tech stack of the government.
Exactly. The dependencies are enormous, the wealth is enormous, and the potential abuse of power is enormous. Look at what Elon Musk is doing through X now, through his personal wealth, supporting far-right parties in Europe. He is basically going into the U.S. government without a mandate, without the kind of accountability that he has, the kind of access that he and his supporters or his staff, whatever the proper term is now, have by going into government agencies, into the tech infrastructure and tweaking that all in the name of efficiency, but outside of what is typically a rule of law-based approach to giving people power, but also making sure that they are subject to oversight, that they are, for example, approved by Congress, which is not the case. And so I think if this would happen in any other country than the United States, people would clearly see there's a conflict of interest. This is blurring the lines. This does not fit in a democratically run state. But now that it's happening in the US, I think people are just paralyzed and shocked at what is happening. But that paralysis cannot last too long. There really needs to be an anchoring back in the US Constitution to make sure that this kind of access and potential abuse of power, conflict of interest doesn't go on as we see it happening today.
There's been periods in America where we've had kind of a different era of now we're going to deal with it. But we had the robber barons, the dividends, and I wonder if that was the time where there was a big Jeff Bezos, the kind of the titans that we are seeing have greater access to the power of the White House.
Many of them actually supply the government of the United States, but also many governments around the world with critical services like cloud computing, as you mentioned, with software suites, with cybersecurity protections. And so there's a huge dependency there. But it also means that these companies know a lot about our societies, about the government, and now apparently Elon Musk is in the heart of the U.S. government with access to all kinds of sensitive data. And so I think that dependency through contracts, through potential use of the sensitive information that these companies have access to, creates a conflict of interest. There are regulatory bodies that Elon Musk is now making decisions about. Actually, their oversight over
understanding.
Well, we've heard the president saying many things that were not accurate in the past. So, just because he said it doesn't make it true. So I think the problem with it is that Elon Musk is gaining access to highly sensitive government data and systems, making consequential decisions about jobs, about budgets, about operations, without a mandate that is typically given to people with such access to these systems. And on top of the fact that he's basically operating with a parallel power structure, so doesn't have to rescind authority over his companies. For example, it's not subject to the same ethics.
What's up, douchebag? Come down here to take a dump?
Congress, for example.
What do you call it?
But it's also just very radical steps with real consequences.
the people listening to the conversation. So look, these CEOs are doing exactly what they should be. You know, I would protect their interests, their corporate interests, their shareholder interests. I'm going from recent
Well, the fines that you mentioned are a lot for people, like they're not that much for these billion-dollar companies. So these are impressive fines. They are just part of the cost of doing business for most tech companies, and we have to ask ourselves whether that's sufficient. But antitrust handles rules about fairness in the economy are based on century-old laws that also exist in the United States. This is not a typical European phenomenon that goes after U.S. companies. In fact, EU-based companies may also be subject to competition and antitrust cases and fines. They can appeal, and then ultimately there is a verdict with possible sanctions. And so I think, you know, if you look at what the FTC has been doing under the Biden administration, the idea that too much power concentration doesn't only hurt the economy and innovation because they can stifle that, but also impacts democracy, has impact on the right to privacy, for example, was something that we share across the Atlantic. It's just with the Trump administration that these tech CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, feel open and say, hey, competition sanctions should actually be considered a tariff. They should be considered part of the trade war that is now expected to be unleashed by Donald Trump, with all the negative consequences that that's going to have. And so indeed, the tech CEOs are very opportunistic, but that doesn't make their claims justified in any way, shape, or form.
If you are a member of the European Parliament, and what you lay out different paths which you kind of what are the steps that we should take.
Well, I think it's crucial to get more transparency into the workings of tech companies impact our society. So think about algorithmic amplification when it comes to social media, think about the public interest in regulating AI models, which is now often shielded by AI companies as a trade secret, but we really need to have capacity to, for example, research AI models much more deeply as academics, for example. I also think it's key that when they use technology to perform, tax services or investigations, they have the same kind of transparency and accountability that they would not outsource these tasks to companies. What we often see is that there is different treatment of, let's say, surveillance practices on the part of police when they are done directly by police forces or when they're outsourced to tech companies. And so having that kind of public accountability is critical. But also bringing independent expertise in legislative bodies so that the lobbyists that are spending, hundreds of billions of dollars to influence our lawmakers are not as successful. So that lawmakers have access to independent expertise on technology related laws.
I want to say to Eric back in 2019, and something you said struck me.
It's very clear that tech companies cannot stay on the fence in taking a position in relation to values and rights.
What? You gotta go
First, we
out?
believe that a rules-based order serves the public interest as well as individual and collective rights and liberties that companies benefit from, but that everybody has a role to play to also contribute to the common interest and to strengthen the resilience of our democracy.
That was 2019, and we got closer to the way for
Much further, unfortunately. I mean, I think we basically lost the stage when it comes to competition.
Yes.
Phew.
Hang on. girl. Boy.
Just throwing sand into the gears of the machine, or they're just jamming up the machine as hard and fast as they can. How it operates, what effects it operates might be on reliant services.
One of the things that really set off red flags for a lot of people is that Musk and this group of young software engineers, apparently, some of them, we're told that one of them was as young as 19 years old, most of them were in their early 20s, have had access to the Treasury's system for dispersing government funds. And this has heretofore been supervised by career employees. The career employee was in charge of this retired it seems, after he objected to them having this. Now, as we are speaking now, a federal judge has said they can only have limited access. Only 2 members of the team can have limited access. It's so-called read-only access. Would you just talk about why this is so concerning?
I think anybody knows exactly what they're doing. That's part of the reason the concern. You know, is when the public about this, they said that Musk only had read-only access to this information. They didn't. They actually had access to go in and it would change the outcomes of these payments. So what people think, although I don't want to just pass on speculation as fact, but it seems as if Musk is inclined to use this tool to advance this anti-government agenda that he set out for himself. Basically, instead of going to Congress and saying, we think this program is too big or this agency should be shut, they're just going to unilaterally cut off the payments to whatever programs that they think should exist, just going straight to the end point. And so that would accomplish his work immediately. And even if the courts were to step in and say, you can't do this, the damage of moves like this would be so difficult to reverse that they might functionally succeed in the goal of defense.
President Trump and his kind of designated agents in this, Elon Musk, have been arguing that these programs are either inefficient or, in their words, corrupt. And they say that
She's on her own.
Inefficient programs, federal government, and there are certainly inefficient systems that prevent the government from functioning effectively. And I know some policy wonks have been writing about this and trying to make it work better. It's very frustrating that they're not listening to people that have really expertise and actually want to make the government more cost-effective. Just running rampant through the government, picking out programs that have names that sound weird to them, or mostly just having people see the pants guesses are doing something bad or failures of this administration they can run against and craft a message. Concern is that while they position themselves to do that, they can't also pick out elected positions for Republicans that'll make it impossible for them to take advantage of the public as a term.
And before we let you go, the courts. I mean, so far the courts have been have confronted Trump and his agenda at multiple points. I mean, they've already said one federal judge has said, look, this idea of eliminating, birthright citizenship of the 14th Amendment is overreach. But there's another argument to suggest that that's his goal, is to get some because he does believe he appointed 3 of the current Supreme Court justices.
Oh, viewer.
Demonstrated that they have a maximal view
Turn it off.
of executive power. Is there
She's already one fan.
on the action of this president?
Well, you're certainly right, and that's one. They have basically two routes. One is that they just can't these cases they change the precedent and they get the court to say actually the executive branch just can unilaterally eliminate the legislative organ it doesn't like. Now that seems to violate the plain text of the Constitution in the way it's been understood for education, housing, and healthcare provide the kind of stability and strength that actually enables people to rise. And so what we found is that we widened inequality, but also stalled mobility. And the story we tell about ourselves, that in America you can make it if you try, is demoralizing under conditions where many people found over the last few decades that no matter how hard they worked, they couldn't get ahead. So not only was there economic inequality and job loss and wage stagnation, but there was also a demoralizing message produced especially by prudential elites who said, if only you work hard, you can make it. If only you get a degree, but it's on you, you can make it. That, in a way, prevented, I think, progressives, the Democratic Party in particular, from stepping back and asking a fundamental question. If Donald Trump is as unfit and as serious a threat to democracy as we think he is, why is it that half the country, or more than half the country, prefers him to what we've been offering? That's a sobering question that Democrats need to ask themselves, looking in the mirror and asking, how do we need to rejuvenate to what extent was it economic? To what extent was it cultural, social issue? To what extent was it a condescension amongst the elite? I think it was all of those things. The election itself, I think, was Donald Trump won that argument. Kamala Harris was not able, for various reasons, successfully to present herself as the agent of change. But beyond that, we had debates in the postmortems. Was it economic reasons, or was it cultural anxiety and anger and grievance?
Come here.
Or was it elites looking down? It was all of those things. And I think
Shush.
but they also felt that they were moved down the path. And this is a volatile economic and cultural difference that I think Donald Trump very successfully did. The Democrats
Smells like a plastic factory. Melting, burning plastic, super strong. No, it's not the worst. Not the worst. No, don't eat that.
very successful president in terms of getting done what he wanted to get done. Jimmy Carter was remarkably unsuccessful. Why are people like you putting so much on this notion of quote intelligence when it doesn't seem to correlate to success with the president?
Well, it depends on how you define success, really, I guess. I don't regard Ronald Reagan as a successful president. I think he was successful in getting elected. In getting his agenda through. But what that agenda was, unfortunately, was very redolent of his own ignorance. He let the AIDS crisis spiral out of control because he was very unaware of what AIDS was or what it meant. He really created homelessness in this country because he thought that, and he said this to David Brinkley, he said the homeless just want to live outside, they don't want homes. So, in terms of ignorance, yes. A guy who's very good on TV, like Ronald Reagan, much better than Jimmy Carter, he cleaned his clock at the debate. He's going to have much more success electorally, and he's going to have a lot of success, perhaps, getting his agenda through. But what that agenda is, and what it will do for America, is another thing that we don't actually read about.
You know, if your books corollary to your book, or really the opposite of your book, is how it stands. So that's what's right. And this is really smart people. You don't get smarter than Mac Bundy or Robert McNamara. And yet, they took us down a path that was not very wise. I'm still asking you, did your books on the ridiculous people who are smart? You know, how do you contrast that with what happened in the best of the right?
Well, smart people make mistakes too, but all I can say is that I am an elitist in the sense that I want people with power to be smarter than I. We always roll the dice with our leaders, right? We elect them, and we don't know what they're going to do. Maybe some of the smarter ones will make mistakes. Some of the dumber ones might surprise us. But over the last 50 years, the guys who've been allergic to knowledge, who refuse to read a briefing book, refuse to read a book of any kind, have gotten us into things like the war in Iraq, some of the hugest disasters in our history, and also really ignored things like AIDS and the coronavirus. So, yes, smart people make mistakes. I consider myself kind of smart. I make mistakes every day, but I'd still rather put my money on the guy who's with me.
Why should you say the word Iraq? You're talking about George W. Bush doing it. Found out that Hillary Clinton was very much related. So was Madeleine Albright. So was Richard Holbrooke. Were they ignorant enough?
No, they're smart and had very bad judgment. But still, the guy who was, president of the United States and didn't pick up a briefing book and didn't read the presidential daily brief that said Bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S., I still think you want a guy or a woman who has the most information. Again, you can look at those people and say, yeah, they are very smart and have bad judgment. I still would rather have a Hillary Clinton in the White House than say, Donald Trump, who doesn't read anything. That's just my preference.
We go back, actually, go way back in American history, as you mentioned that earlier. But one thing that interested me was Harding. Did you say in some way at the beginning of this? Explain to me why you think Harding sort of exemplifies this aid to ignorance at the end.
Well, it's funny. I have kind of a contrarian view of Warren G. Harding. I think he's actually gotten kind of a raw deal. Mencken said that he was one of the dumbest, biggest nitwits ever in the annals of American history. Of course, Mencken didn't live to see some of the people we're dealing with currently. But Warren G. Harding actually, I think, has gotten a raw deal. He did a lot of good things, or tried to, when he was president. He actually gave a major civil rights address, which was controversial and taking risks. So in a way, I'm actually a defender of Harding. I feel like he's been unfairly blind. He wasn't great. He wasn't one of our greatest presidents, and he certainly left something to be desired. But he had a strong place. Maybe it's not a great plot, but I'm a little bit of a Warren G. Harding defender.
Yeah, and you talk about H.L. Mencken, a smart guy, a really smart guy.
What do you got? I'm here.
He was a racist. He was anti-Semitic. He was pro-Nazi. I don't get the correlation between being smart and having good judgment.
Well, there isn't always. I mean, I think that I still say that I would rather have, if I have to roll the dice, I'd rather roll the dice on the guy who's smart than on the guy who hasn't read it. With the word smart again keeps on kind of, you and I use slightly different terms because I don't really know exactly how to measure how smart somebody is. I can measure how informed or how intellectually curious they are, and the way I can measure that is by their habits and what they do. You know, what they read. I mean, one interesting thing I learned in researching the book, Walter, is that a lot of people who were great in school weren't necessarily our best presidents. A lot of our best presidents weren't great in school. I like to look at somebody like FDR, a C student, not a great scholar. But when it came to things like the Dust Bowl, which was an ecological disaster that we'd never seen the likes of before, he knew what he didn't know. And he surrounded himself with experts who did know stuff. And he listened to experts. He didn't, like Donald Trump, say, I know more than the generals, I know more than the scientists. He listened, he learned, he took their advice, and the Dust Bowl was resolved in a really good way. And that was, to me, that's an example of somebody who has intellectual humility. We get in trouble, I agree with you, sometimes with people who think that they are the best and the brightest and they know more than anybody else. And as a result, they don't feel that they have anything to learn. I think that's dangerous. And I think smart people sometimes fall into that trap. It's better, I think, to say,
USAID has been propping up sites like Politico, giving them $8 million in taxpayer funds in just one fiscal year, meaning the Politico is state-funded media stealing from you, the taxpayer. Except that isn't really accurate. The truth, it turns out, is much less sinister. So let's walk through. This whole debacle, it started when Politico was late with the payroll list. And that, thanks to what they said, was a technical error that was resolved by the end of the day, so everyone got paid. But then what we saw is that with that, you would post, including screenshots from the government website tracking federal spending, showing that Politico received $8 million from the government in the 2024 fiscal year. Former Fox News producer Kyle Becker sharing these screenshots and saying, fun fact, Politico received USAID funds. So seemingly claiming that the $8 million came from USAID alone, and then, in a follow-up post, he connected Politico's late payroll with the recent crackdowns on USAID's spending. And from there, the situation just exploded with big names on the right chiming in and spreading this far and wide. And even had Trump on Truth Social this morning saying that billions have been stolen from federal agencies like USAID and gone to, quote, news media as a payroll, creating good stories about the Democrats and then adding, this could be the biggest scandal of them all, perhaps the biggest in history. But then, with all this, there's been a whole lot of pushback against this narrative. For example, the Washington Post pointing out that if you look deeper into the government spending website, you'll see that USAID gave Politico only $44,000 during the fiscal years of 2024. And that was reportedly for subscriptions to an energy and environment publication that the company produces. And then, that $8 million, right, the amount the entire government spent on Politico last year, most of that reportedly came from contracts or subscriptions to their premium service. In fact, you had the Post reporting that just days ago, the White House's Office of the National Cyber Director signed a $35,000 contract for a Politico Pro premium subscription for 15 users. With that service, tracking, analyzing, and providing updates on the entire public policy landscape. I mean, for example, the Post reports that committees led by Republicans dropped $500,000 on Politico subscriptions in the first 9 months of last year, with 38 Republicans in the House reportedly spending $300,000 for subscriptions within the same time period. Follow to stay in the loop. USAID has been propping up sites like Politico, giving them $8 million in tax.
You are using apple cider vinegar the wrong way. If your goal is to lose belly fat,
Overnight, we got some news. A federal judge issuing an order temporarily blocking Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, from accessing the Treasury Department's payment systems. Now, this comes after 19 attorneys general filed suit accusing the administration of breaking federal law by giving DOGE access to federal computer systems that include sensitive personal data.
And another judge is temporarily blocking President Trump's order plan to place more than 2,000 USAID workers on leave Halt's plan gives to give overseas aid workers just 30 days to move back to the country on the government's dime. The judge claims it would have exposed workers and their families to unwarranted risk and expense.
And those rulings from the bench adding hurdles to Trump's plans to slash government wasteful spending. But despite the block-on actions to scale back USAID, crews have already taken down signage from the agency's DC headquarters. You've got to just love all this. What do you? I mean, let's just talk about this, Charlie. From your both of you guys are actually DC guys. I know you're a rural guy, but you're a DC guy in a lot of ways. You know what's going on. Just how absolutely explosive and revolutionary is what we have seen in the last.
No, Griff and I were just talking about it a minute ago off camera. Like it's like you're 3 weeks in, and overbloated bureaucratic government and how it does not serve the American people. And to Charlie's point, here we are 30 years later, and Trump said, I'm taking a wrecking ball to it. And it's actually happening, and it's really remarkable. And what you're finding is that Democrats aren't defending the actual transgender opera in Colombia or the DEI program in Serbia. They're literally showing that they are addicted to the status quo. And the addiction to the status quo is this overbloated bureaucracy that is wasting American taxpayer dollars in places like USAID.
I think it's more than addiction. I think their entire apparatus has been upheld by this. They have been funding media outlets. They have been funding, revolutions in other countries. We have been funding all kinds of stuff that the American people never signed up for. And there are people that are profiting off that. There are NGOs. There's a whole mediocre class of people who have been surviving off of the largesse of the American people through these shadowy networks within these agencies. And look, out of these agencies, we're also getting some whistleblowers to help us see it, not just all the stuff that the little engineers, the 20-year-olds as they're calling them, are uncovering, but people within the agencies who have been disgusted with what they've seen and are coming forward. Here's somebody who was an employee at USAID, who was on Jesse Waters' show, and talked to also to the Fox Digital people as well. This is from an op-ed. He said how USAID went woke and destroyed itself. He said USAID was formed in 1961 to counter Soviet efforts to spread communism in the developing world, to transition former communist countries into U.S. allies, and respond to global disasters. But sometime during the Clinton administration, USAID began to promote radical social agendas such as population control. Under President Barack Obama, LGBT and climate ideologies were added, and then President Joe Biden topped it off with transgenderism. Institutionally, its political culture would eventually skew far left, purge conservatives and independents, and here is...
But just real quick, that's somebody who loves USAID, loves the work USAID does, but recognizes that it's completely
Gotten off track.
the rails. And then a completely separate whistleblower went on Jesse last night and basically said the same thing. And again, these are the people that love the mission, but realize it's gone completely off the rails.
I was elevated to be the acting deputy chief of staff of the Global Health Bureau during COVID, and I immediately observed incredible delay and arrogance on the part of career bureaucrats who I fought and frankly cleaned up their mess. And instead of being appreciative and avoided an embarrassment, I was retaliated against. I had to sue them under the Whistleblower Protection Act, which is detailed in my op-ed, and then they proceeded to bodge 10 times more money. I should add, this was under the career bureaucrats. There were political appointees like our recent assistant administrator, Tuolumande, who did a good job of streamlining bureaucracy. And that's where there are important programs that I'm concerned are going to be thrown out with a bureaucracy that has grown over 6 decades without enough accountability. There have been efforts to reform that not successful. And so I hope that this can be an act of creative destruction, which is a good thing, instead of just total destruction, which would be the concern level.
Sounds like the American people, from what I'm hearing and feeling around the country, and I am in touch with a lot of people around the country, they're willing to take that gamble. They're willing to see some good stuff just ends up getting cut, just to get rid of this whole Leviathan.
Yeah, and look, both President Trump and Elon Musk and others have said, you look at things like PEPFAR and combating AIDS in Africa, important things aren't going to die here. The USAID, of course, will have the purview, State Department overseeing it, and can keep these programs that are serving a purpose in place. And American people, it's just a waste in our hard-earned tax dollars that we're going to rein in a little bit.
Joni Ernst talked earlier this week that she tried to get oversight, and many senators have been saying this. They've been trying to get oversight over USAID and get some transparency. They were never allowed in to look at it. So maybe you have to sort of get rid of all of it, and then we can go, oh, this is a good program to help children with AIDS.
Preposterous, by the way, because Congress created USAID.
I know.
It's for a lot of them it is a religion, but it's also become a structure from which they make lots of money.
Introducing the new Ego Power Plus 2-stage snowblower, a heavy-duty workhorse with unmatched power from the never...
Its funding pool and its staff sent home, the world's largest international humanitarian donor, USAID, is under assault. If the Trump administration doesn't restore the flow of aid, who will US influence? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Purana. President Donald Trump's administration is dismantling the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. For decades, it's been the world's premier humanitarian agency, distributing life-saving medications, combating the spread of disease, and providing disaster relief in conflict zones. Thousands of employees have been placed on leave, and aid recipients in more than 130 countries have been left in limbo. Spearheading federal budget cuts is billionaire Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency. While it may represent an instant saving on the books, We'll get to those questions in a moment, but first this report by Michael Apple.
For more than 60 years, the United States Agency for International Development has been at the forefront of every global humanitarian initiative. Food parcels, medication, HIV/AIDS kits, civil service capacity building in developing nations. USAID was behind it all.
USAID has been the biggest HIV funder. And I would say that a number of people, close to 20 million people, are receiving ARVs, art treatment, testing services from the funds that USAID has been providing to us.
But that's all stopped, at least for now. US President Donald Trump sees the aid agency's 2023 budget of $40 billion as a waste of money, too woke, and not aligned with his America First agenda.
I love the concept, but they turn out to be radical left lunatics.
USAID was established by John F. Kennedy in 1961. He signed an executive order which created it as an independent agency. But it's come into the crosshairs of billionaire Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, a task force birthed via one of Trump's executive orders. USAID's website has been taken down, and a notice placing roughly 10,000 employees on administrative leave is all that remains. The announcement met with anger on the streets of Washington, D.C., and promises of court action.
The key issue with Musk's actions is that it's happening in this zone that we could best describe as a gray legal zone, or perhaps more accurately described as a zone of illegality. So he is effectively shutting down an American government agency that requires an act of Congress.
It's a question that keeps cropping up.
Will it take an act of Congress to do away with USAID, or do you believe you have...
I don't know. I don't think so. No, not when it comes to fraud. If there's fraud, these people are lunatics. And if it comes to fraud, you wouldn't have an act of Congress.
Trump wants America to project strength at home and abroad. He's casting aside anything he sees as impacting his administration's bottom line. It's a move critics say declares the age of America's soft power well and truly over. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. From Washington, D.C., we're joined by Harden Lang, the Vice President for Programs and Policy at Refugees International. In Colchester in the UK is Natasha Linstead, a U.S. Foreign Policy Specialist and a Professor of Government at the University of Essex. And in Nairobi is Alan Boswell, the International Crisis Group's Project Director for the Horn of Africa. A very warm welcome to all of you. Natasha, I'll start with you in Colchester. The U.S. says that every dollar it spends has to be justified with the answer to the questions: does it make America safer, more stronger, and more prosperous? Is the freezing of USAID in line with these goals?
No, not at all. I mean, this is such a significant shift in U.S. humanitarian policy, and it is not making Americans safer, but it's definitely not making many people who are vulnerable safer, because USAID was instrumental in providing life-saving vaccines. I mean, all the work that, if we just even look at the area of global health, where USAID had worked in partnership with organizations like PEPFAR to help prevent the spread of AIDS, saving somewhere around 26 million lives, or had worked to support the malaria vaccine, or to fight malaria, which kills 450,000 children under 5. And their work on that has helped save 7 million lives, or in fighting TB, which kills over 1 million people still. And their work on that has saved some 79 million people. So in addition to all the work that they do in the healthcare field, they're instrumental in disaster relief, in providing food aid, and then also in support of democracy. Yeah, so this is really catastrophic on a number of fronts.
Harden, Natasha talked about how devastating this is for vulnerable communities, especially. How does it look for the world's richest man, Elon Musk, to be unplugging a lifeline to the world's poorest people?
Honestly, if there were a way in which America has shown up in the rest of the world, in many of these communities that are facing humanitarian crisis, that are mired in poverty, AID and its programming have been that face. And what Elon Musk is doing, in essence, is pulling the plug on all of that. It's not hard to see how this narrative is going to play in countries and communities around the world because it's already gathering some steam. I mean, the fact that you had sort of Russia and China welcome this move tells you a lot about what it's doing to U.S. soft power and the perceptions of the United States writ large. I mean, as though we have gone into hospitals and sort of unplugged the ventilators. People who were counting on their HIV meds the next day show up and the door is locked. The ripple effect of this throughout communities. So you have, women from Afghanistan, who are on the run from the Taliban inside of Afghanistan or in Pakistan, whose safe houses have had to shutter their doors. So the level at which this is going to ripple out across communities and countries amongst the world's poorest, but then even people who are watching this, our allies and partners, are we reliable as a country to show up both when they need it for humanitarian assistance or to support them in Ukraine, for example? Like the message is going to be clear that we are not reliable and that actually an unaccountable billionaire, an oligarch, has the ability to unplug what has been a global lifeline and insurance policy.
And is probably the region that will be most impacted by the freezing of this aid. What has been the fallout there already that you can tell, from soup kitchens where you are in Nairobi to the tens of millions in Sudan who need food aid?
Yeah, it's total mayhem. There's two, I'd say, main areas that have people especially worried, one of which is the amount of food aid coming from the United States. It's by far the largest donor to WFP and to other implementing partners. Although the technical food aid has, the life-saving emergency food aid has a technical waiver, in practice so many people have been laid off or put on leave that essentially, and many of the NGOs themselves have actually had to fire people or stop work, that the result has been no one even knows what's being delivered anymore. I've heard stories of NGOs actually returning food to WFP warehouses, for instance, because even though WFP's been allowed to continue, the NGOs have been so affected that they can't. These are places where people are starving to death, such as in Sudan. The second one is the public health support, HIV, malaria, tuberculosis. The U.S. was by far the biggest contributor there, and a lot of those programs are essentially on hold. Again, they might pick up, but I think the underlying thing to know is that in the meantime, it's unclear how much the U.S. will eventually come back and put some and get some of these programs running. But in the meantime, definitely Africans will die.
And Natasha, as Alan is saying, there has been so much confusion. I mean, you mentioned PEPFAR, which supports millions of people who need support for HIV, and even, the waiver about that is unclear. Absolute confusion. But do you think that this is something that this U.S. administration will actually be able to do, whether it's merging USAID with the State Department or trying to scale it back to the level that it is?
I mean, USAID is not supposed to be part of the State Department. It's supposed to be independent, and it received congressional approval and funding. So it doesn't really work when it's part of the State Department, particularly this State Department led by Marco Rubio, who has really been promoting this Trump's agenda, that everybody that works for the Trump government administration has to be in line with Trump's ideological goals. And that's not really the purpose of a humanitarian agency or organization that is trying to save lives. And they're trying to find people who are disloyal and create a much leaner organization that will only have really lacking people without, the type of experience. And I know they are keeping some people there, but I mean, the way that they've gutted the workforce is just incredible. You only have some 12 people working in Africa now, some 8 working in Latin America and the Caribbean, 21 people working for the entire Middle East and Asia. I mean, it's very difficult for an organization to function when it has been gutted so completely.
And Carden, what kind of challenges do you expect to this from the U.S. Congress itself?
Sure, but let me just go back to the question that was just asked. I think this is super important. Like, part of what you're seeing now, the numbers that we're seeing is that we're going to have most of the USAID workforce laid off or furloughed. So we're getting to a point with about 290 officers are supposed to be transferred from USAID over to the State Department. Right? If you say that USAID roughly has a budget of, say, $40 billion in a given year, and then say 10 to 14,000, depending on how you count the employees working there overseeing that, if you're just transferring 300 people over to the State Department to oversee ongoing aid programs, they're going to have the capacity to oversee a fraction of that $40 billion. So we're talking about USAID total humanitarian and development aid going down to a couple of $1 billion if we're lucky in the interim. What's also happening here is while we're waiting for Congress and the courts to really kick in to exercise their oversight, what you're having is the destruction of the agency through the cutting of contracts, through the firing of employees, furloughing, through the stop work orders to the entire ecosystem of NGOs that support the system. So the goal here, I think, is to push Humpty Dumpty off the wall, have him hit and crash on the ground and shatter into a billion pieces before Congress can step in and act. I think the timeline that we're looking here for is that there's a reconciliation process, a budget process that's going to kick in the United States to try to keep the lights on for the government across the system by March 14th. The hope is that USAID will be able to kick in before that, or that the Congress will kick in to exercise its oversight and its actual constitutional authority here, because to be honest, we're in the midst of a constitutional crisis. The fact that the world's richest man has gone in and unplugged a system with some dubious authority to do so, this is the moment that Congress needs to step up and exercise its mandate for an agency that it is mandated existence thereof. The question is, can that happen in time?
Yeah, and Alan, while we wait for that to happen and see if that happens in the meantime, countries like China are already filling the void in aid programs in the Pacific. How much of an opportunity is this for countries like China to fill the gap left by USAID?
It's an interesting question because I actually think the type of programs USAID did at large is something that many will actually not come back and do. I think USAID, in hindsight, historically, I don't mean to talk about it in past tense already, but I think it'll probably, this will look like something like a closing chapter on a type of aid that it was aid that was viewed as being purposely apolitical, that was distributed intentionally almost so there wasn't political leverage tied to it. The type of aid that will be coming in from Russia or China, for instance, will come with strings attached. It may very well be that future aid coming from the United States might have a lot more strings attached too. I think, and it goes without saying that there was obviously a lot of bloat in the system. There was a lot of aid that actually the countries themselves, the leaders themselves, even sometimes the people themselves, didn't even like or want. I think there are kind of two categories. There's the very life-saving aid, which is highly disruptive to cut off. And then I do think there will be a lot of programs where there won't be many more who miss it or even notice that they're gone except for who they employ. And a lot of that will never be picked up by someone else.
Natasha, that's a really interesting point that Alan is making, that, not all of the aid, of course the bulk of it is humanitarian, but not all of it is humanitarian. The really interesting thing is that while the humanitarian sector is reeling from this announcement, there are some authoritarian regimes, including Russia and China, but everywhere from El Salvador, Belarus, Nicaragua, Venezuela, all cheering on the dismantling of U.S. aid. Can you tell us why?
They are because organizations like USAID that provide democracy support, that support civil society, that support human rights and the rule of law. These types of programs are, they undermine authoritarian regimes, and so they're often a target, whether it be them or other NGOs, which is why we saw a flurry of anti-NGO laws that were passed by authoritarian regimes. They really want these types of organizations to be dismantled because it poses a threat to their rule. And we have found that they can be effective in supporting civil society, and this is one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin was so threatened by when there have been protests after fraudulent elections, because organizations like this help mobilize these groups and help spread best practices about pushing for accountability and transparency. So of course they're rejoicing. So it's not just that, but also there is a void in soft power. I mean, China has spent in the last 12 years over $1 trillion in promoting, the Belt Road Initiative and other forms of soft power, and there'll be a void there with the loss of what looks like the loss of USAID, and in that it's not going to be supporting these human rights-based, democracy-based projects, and we do see that the level of democracy globally is affected by hegemons like the U.S. and the quality of democracy in the U.S., of course, but the role that they play in supporting democracy in the world.
And what impact do you see that having on, everything from civil society organizations to NGOs?
Sure. So let's take it in sort of two groups. There are like international NGOs who have footprints in a couple of countries in certain regions to a global presence, not dissimilar to that of the United Nations. For the international NGOs, what we're seeing, and contractors for USAID, is that global stop work orders has had like a catastrophic effect, right? We're seeing layoffs of 40% to 90% of staff. And this is once you've actually laid the staff off, sort of rebuilding that if money were to come back online is going to take a long time. It's going to take effort. So we really are seeing a cascade effect across the ecosystem of implementing partners at the international NGO level that provided everything from sort of development assistance to the support for public health programs to the emergency humanitarian assistance that's supposed to have some waivers, but which in effect is not functioning. That system is collapsing globally. At the civil society level inside of countries, things like civil society organizations, local organizations, really are sort of the front line of the effort, right? These are the folks who are on the front line in Ukraine and elsewhere, really providing assistance to communities in need and getting that money and support from the international NGOs and the United Nations. We were already hearing from a number of them that they were having to shut down their programming, right? And these organizations are critical not just for actually meeting needs, but they are the bedrock of civil society, and something that is very deeply in the U.S. strategic interest to see civil society strengthening inside of countries, because a strong civil society, A, is good for stability, but it's also good for values. It's the sort of organizations that pursue democracy, anti-corruption, human rights issues, and there's a very real danger that the kind of external support upon which many of these civil society organizations rely is crumbling very quickly, and they will find ways to continue to survive, hopefully, but it's going to do very significant damage at a strategic level to civil society to sort of play the role that we always depend on civil society to play.
But Alan, do you think that this U.S. administration is at all interested in building up strong civil societies in other countries? Because as Donald Trump and Elon Musk have repeatedly said, what the USAID is doing is not aligned with the administration's goals.
Look, a lot of these civil society, quote-unquote pro-democracy grants from USAID have had very strong bipartisan support for a long time, but it's clear that support really doesn't come from the Trump administration. And a lot of other countries, I think, have stopped, also view this support as unwelcome as well. So you could see in the Trump administration, it's very transactional. A lot of, I'll speak about Africa, a lot of African leaders don't really appreciate that the U.S. basically funds a lot of what we call civil society, what they see as political activists, and then this can be a drag sometimes on their relations. You can see that the Trump administration, which wants to take a very transactional approach, wants to do deals, doesn't have a great democracy record at home, to say the least. You can see why those sort of programs are not something that will, that will get restarted, and we'll see how much appetite there is for actually starting it after a Trump administration, and whether this bipartisan consensus that had been there in the U.S. system is now just gone.
Natasha, Alan was talking earlier about how China will not be interested, or China doesn't have the appetite to cover all the kinds of programs that the USAID funding gap will leave. It's a huge gap, but given that, they work on things that will affect countries beyond the borders where the aid is distributed, things like preventing organized crime, terrorism, conflict, and the impact that will have on human security. Are there any other countries that we can expect, maybe European nations, for example, to try and fill some of this gap?
That's a good question. I mean, traditionally the Scandinavian countries in particular have been big donors. And of course they've donated quite a bit in terms of a percentage of GDP. And they're often above the 0.7% that countries are supposed to spend on foreign aid. But it's hard to fill this gap because the U.S. was the biggest donor, even though the U.S. was far below what the expectations were in terms of both its federal budget, where it's under 1%, or its foreign aid was 0.2% or something along those lines. It's hard for all these smaller countries to meet all the demands, all the humanitarian crises that are taking place around the world. Though I think you're going to see Europe trying to step up, but you have to also understand at the same time Europe is facing huge costs with the ongoing war in Ukraine. And so there are so many fires to put out at the same time that this loss of the U.S. In terms of the role of a major foreign aid actor, it is really going to have monumental effects on human security.
Yeah, human security that it's already having around the world. And I was reading that the Democratic Party politicians have been talking about how it could jeopardize U.S. national security. They cited prison guards in Syria who are in charge of securing ISIL fighters temporarily walked off the job when the U.S. funding was cut off, for example.
Yeah, there are any number of examples of where the sort of the touch points between what USAID does and U.S. national security are quite clear. The example of the camps in northeast Syria, where in essence the administration had not thought through or recognized that if you pull the plugs on civilian assistance, you're going to pull the plug on one of the contractors in northeast Syria that was providing the security for the camps where tens of thousands of ISIS families and probably some fighters were still living under the guard of the Syrian partners, other Syrian partners in the area. And this had a huge ripple effect across the system. People gained some visibility of it. But there are lots of other examples of this, or other places where the touch points between national security and development humanitarian assistance are clear. And one thing just to keep in mind, let's go back to Ebola in 2014-15. In that crisis, right, the Ebola crisis led to, in West Africa, led to a huge mobilization on the part of the United States and others to contain it. And that's because when President Obama saw the projections of what could happen, the spread, the millions of people who could be killed, and the possibility that disease getting to the United States and doing very serious damage, a full court press effort was put into place involving civilian actors, the U.S. military and support, etc., to try to help and contain that. If in essence you were taking the tools from that toolkit and removing them, you are creating huge vulnerability to the United States to the massive spread of these kind of diseases. As we've seen under COVID, if you don't have those tools in the toolkit, there's very direct national security implications and human security implications, not just abroad, but in the United States.
And Alan, even if the cuts to USAID are going to be successfully challenged in the courts, just how much damage do you think this has already done, not just in terms of all of the people that aid has been cut off from, but to America's reputation as a reliable partner?
Sure. Well, I don't think the U.S. is seen as a reliable partner. That is not only because of the way USA was put through the wood chipper, as it was said. But the Trump administration coming in for a second term is seen by most other countries in the world as a signal